He thought it was just another morning patrol, until the forest went silent, and a mother grizzly stepped out of the fog. He had walked these woods for 20 years, but that morning the forest felt different, quieter, almost watchful. The mist hung low over the valley, wrapping every pine and boulder in a soft silver haze. Ranger Elijah Moore adjusted his worn hat and took a slow breath, feeling the damp chill settle into his jacket. Morning patrol was usually his favorite part of the day, when the world was still half asleep and even the wind seemed to whisper instead of roar. But this morning something was off. The usual chatter of chickadees had gone silent. No cracking of twigs, no scurrying chipmunks. Just stillness. He stopped, hand resting on his rifle strap, not because he planned to use it but out of habit. Every ranger in the Montana backcountry knew what silence meant. Somewhere not far something large was awake. Elijah crouched beside a patch of wet soil, his eyes scanning the ground. A faint trail of paw prints, broad, deep, and unmistakable. Grizzly. And not just one. He counted 3, maybe 4 sets, the smaller ones half the size of the largest. Cubs. A family. He exhaled through his nose, both cautious and curious. He'd spent his life teaching campers how to stay away from bears. But now his instinct urged him forward, not to chase but to understand. Families of grizzlies didn't usually linger this close to ranger trails unless something had driven them from higher ground. He followed the tracks uphill, careful to keep his steps light. The air was cold enough that his breath came in thin clouds. Pines gave way to a rocky slope overlooking a stream, and that's when he heard it, a low, rhythmic huff, almost like someone breathing heavily in the fog. Elijah froze. The sound came again from beyond a fallen cedar. Slowly he lifted his binoculars. Through the haze, shapes began to form. A hulking brown figure bent low beside the water, and 2 smaller ones tumbling clumsily in the shallows. Cubs. He swallowed hard, not from fear but awe. The mother bear nudged one of her cubs closer, the sunlight faintly catching on her thick fur as it shimmered with droplets of river water. She was magnificent, powerful, massive, yet gentle with her young. The cubs squeaked and pawed at her belly, trying to climb as any children would. Elijah lowered the binoculars and whispered to himself, "You've got quite the family there, don't you, girl?" He'd seen hundreds of bears in his time, but something about this one felt personal, familiar. The scar across her shoulder. He remembered patching up a wounded grizzly years ago near Glacier Creek. Could it be the same one? The memory tugged at him, an image of a frightened cub and a bleeding mother from a wildfire rescue nearly 8 years back. He never forgot those eyes, wary, wild, but intelligent. Now as the mist thinned, those same eyes turned toward him. The mother bear lifted her head. Her gaze locked onto the ridge where Elijah stood. She didn't growl. She didn't move. She just stared. Elijah didn't dare breathe. The air between them seemed to hum, 2 beings from different worlds, sharing a moment neither could explain. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, she stepped forward, her cubs stopping behind her. The sound of pebbles under her weight echoed across the water. Elijah's heartbeat quickened. He knew enough to back away to avoid making eye contact. But something held him there, a silent understanding that if he moved too suddenly, the fragile peace would shatter. The bear stopped a few feet from the stream, sniffing the air. Her ears twitched. Then, almost imperceptibly, she huffed, not in warning but in acknowledgement, before turning back toward her cubs. Elijah exhaled shakily. He should have left. He knew he should have. But as she guided her cubs deeper into the fog, something deep inside him whispered that this was only the beginning. As he turned to head back to camp, a faint cry echoed from the trees behind him, high-pitched, desperate, and unmistakably not human. The moment Elijah turned toward that cry, the forest stopped feeling quiet. It began to breathe with him. The sound was sharp and thin, slicing through the morning stillness like a wire pulled too tight. Elijah froze mid-step, one boot still lifted off the damp earth. It wasn't the low rumble of a bear or the flutter of startled birds. This was higher, smaller, the kind of sound a creature makes when it's in trouble. He slowly turned his head toward the trees, scanning the shadows that wove between mossy trunks. The mist was heavier on this side of the ridge, swallowing light like smoke. He adjusted his binoculars, but all he saw was a swirl of gray-white fog shifting in slow waves. Another cry. Louder this time. And closer. His pulse quickened, but his instincts remained sharp. Not fear, but awareness. Years of ranger work had trained him to separate noise from meaning. This wasn't a human. This wasn't a bird. This was a cub. The realization hit him like a cold gust down his collar. Cubs often cried like that when separated from their mother, a sound that could travel far across valleys. And if the mother bear heard it too? Elijah didn't want to imagine the panic that might follow. He crouched low and began moving toward the sound. Every step was measured, boots rolling on their sides to soften the crunch of leaves. The forest floor was slick, tangled with roots and ferns. He pushed a branch aside, then another, until the slope dipped downward into a shallow ravine. Down there, something moved. A small shape against the fallen trunk of an old pine, shivering. He inched closer. Through the mist, he saw a cub, no more than a year old, caught awkwardly between a tangle of broken branches. Its hind leg was pinned, not bleeding but trapped. The little creature kept crying out, pawing at the air, its wide dark eyes full of panic. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. A cub separated from its mother was a dangerous situation, not because of the cub itself, but because of what might come charging after. He scanned the tree line. The mother and her 2 cubs had disappeared into the opposite valley moments ago. This one, it didn't belong to that group. Or maybe it did and it had fallen behind. The cub's cry echoed again. Elijah's hands clenched. He could walk away, call in a team, follow protocol. But in these woods, time wasn't a luxury. If a predator found it or the mother returned frenzied and defensive, the outcome could turn tragic fast. He knelt at the edge of the ravine, whispering softly, almost to himself. "Easy now, no one's gonna hurt you." The cub's ears twitched, but it didn't stop crying. He scanned the trunk. The branch pinning its leg wasn't too thick, but it was twisted awkwardly. He'd need leverage. He pulled his survival knife from his belt and began cutting through smaller branches around the main knot. Slowly. Quietly. But the forest wasn't silent anymore. Somewhere behind him, twigs snapped. Elijah's spine stiffened. He didn't turn around, not yet. The snapping continued, deliberate, heavy. A rhythm only a large animal could make. The cub whimpered louder, sensing it too. Elijah's hand tightened on the knife. His heart thudded against his ribs. He whispered under his breath, "Not now." One more branch gave way with a soft crack. The cub wriggled, almost free. He could see the fear in its trembling paws, the way it kept glancing past him toward the sound. The footsteps grew louder, steady, calm, and unmistakably close. Elijah slowly turned his head over his shoulder. Through the mist, a massive silhouette emerged between the trees. A mother grizzly, not the one from the stream, was standing at the top of the ravine, eyes fixed on him, and her trapped cub. Elijah didn't breathe, not because he forgot how, but because even air felt too loud in that moment. The mother grizzly stood at the ridge like a shadow carved from the mist itself. Her fur glistened with moisture, thick and heavy, the faint sunlight catching along her shoulders. Elijah could see the steam of her breath, steady but deep, like the slow draw of a bellows. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The cub whimpered again, twisting helplessly under the fallen branch. That small, desperate sound shattered whatever fragile stillness lingered. The mother's massive head lowered and her muscles tensed. Elijah felt the weight of her stare settle on him, not the mindless fury people imagined, but an ancient, precise calculation. She wasn't attacking. Not yet. She was measuring. Deciding. He raised both hands slowly, palms outward, knife sheathed now at his belt. "Easy, girl," he whispered, voice low, steady as water over stone. "I'm not here to hurt him. Just trying to help." His tone mattered more than his words. Years in the wilderness had taught him that. Bears didn't understand language, but they understood rhythm. The pulse beneath your voice, the heartbeat you couldn't hide. The grizzly's nostrils flared. She took one deliberate step down the slope, her claws slicing faint lines into the mud. Elijah resisted the urge to move back. Every ranger instinct screamed, "Don't run, don't make noise, don't break eye contact too long." He kept talking softly, his voice trembling at the edges despite himself. "He stuck, see? Just stuck." He gestured slightly toward the cub. The cub gave a sharp cry, jerking its leg again, the branch creaked. The mother froze, eyes flicking between Elijah and her baby. This was the moment. He had maybe 10 seconds before instinct took over her judgment. He knelt slowly, deliberately, keeping his shoulders low. "All right, kiddo," he murmured, "one more push." He pressed his boot lightly against the fallen trunk and leaned his full weight. The wood groaned, splintered, then snapped. The cub tumbled free with a small yelp, scrambling backward on shaky paws. Elijah didn't move. His chest heaved, adrenaline roaring through him. The cub, sensing freedom, rushed uphill, straight toward its mother. The sound of their reunion was raw and brief, a deep huff from the mother, a soft whine from the cub. She sniffed him over, licking the dirt from his fur, ensuring he was unharmed. Elijah could see her flank rising and falling fast, heart pounding as fiercely as his own. Then the unexpected happened. Instead of charging, she lifted her head and looked at him again. Not with the wild anger of an animal defending her young, but with something quieter. Something that almost resembled acknowledgement. Her gaze held him for a long moment. Then she gave a single short huff, not aggressive but firm, final, before nudging the cub gently and turning back into the forest shadows. The two disappeared between the trees, their shapes swallowed by fog. Elijah stayed frozen for several seconds more, afraid that any movement might undo what he'd just witnessed. Then he finally let out a shaky breath, his whole body trembling. He sank to one knee, wiping his forehead. "I'm getting too old for this," he muttered, half laughing, half shaking. But as he looked at the space where the bears had vanished, a strange feeling settled over him. Not fear, not even relief. It was something deeper. Respect. There had been understanding in that stare. A kind of trust neither man nor animal could ever fully explain. He started back toward his trail, brushing dirt from his knees. The mist was lifting now, revealing streaks of pale sunlight through the trees. He almost convinced himself it was over, just another encounter to file in a ranger's log. Almost. Because when he reached the clearing near his camp, the tracks waiting there in the mud made his stomach drop. They weren't human. And they weren't alone. Mini cliffhanger, fresh paw prints, much larger than the mother's, circled his tent, pressed deep and deliberate into the earth. When Elijah saw the paw prints circling his camp, his first thought wasn't fear, it was that the forest was trying to tell him something. The morning fog had thinned to ribbons of light, and the air smelled faintly of pine sap and wet moss. Elijah's camp sat quietly in a small clearing between two towering spruces, his canvas tent, a weathered log stool and a half-burned fire pit still warm from dawn coffee. But now the calmness felt staged, too still, too deliberate. His boots sank into the soft mud as he stepped closer to the prints. They were enormous. He knelt, tracing the curve of one with his gloved fingers. The claw marks alone were nearly 3 inches long. "Adult male," he muttered under his breath. "And a big one." He glanced around. The prints didn't wander, they formed a rough half-circle around the tent, close enough that the bear could have brushed against the canvas. The ashes in the fire pit had been disturbed too, as if something had pawed curiously at the stones. He stood up, scanning the treeline. The forest was quiet again but not empty. He could feel the watchfulness, that subtle hum of life just beyond sight. It wasn't the mother from before, he was sure of it. These prints were heavier, broader, the stride longer. This bear had walked here with intent. He checked his supplies, food sealed, rifle untouched, pack unopened. Nothing missing. Nothing torn. Just observed. He crouched again, following the prints toward the far side of the clearing. They stopped abruptly near a patch of moss where the soil hardened. From there, smaller tracks branched off, lighter, almost delicate. Cubs again? A thought flickered in his mind. What if the big male wasn't hunting, but searching? Elijah rubbed his temple. He'd seen male grizzlies become aggressive during mating season, even toward cubs that weren't theirs. But this felt different. The tracks overlapped near the edge, as if the large bear had followed behind the family he saw earlier. He knelt in silence, letting the idea settle. If that male was tracking the mother and her cubs, then they might be in danger, and he'd led them straight toward it. The realization hit like a stone in his gut. His breath came out shallow. Damn it. He packed his gear fast, strapped his map pouch, tightened his boots and slung his rifle over his shoulder. He didn't plan to use it, but the presence of a dominant male grizzly changed everything. He wasn't just a ranger now. He was a witness in something primal, a silent war for survival written across the forest floor. He moved swiftly through the underbrush, following the trail eastward. The ground dipped and rose through clusters of ferns. The tracks were fresh, still wet at the edges. His pace quickened. As he climbed a ridge, the wind shifted, carrying a scent, musky, thick, unmistakable. Bear. Close. He crouched instantly, sliding behind a fallen tree. The valley below opened in a wide bowl of rock and grass. Near the center he spotted movement, the mother bear and her 2 cubs foraging near the stream. But she wasn't alone. Across the clearing, half hidden behind birches, the larger male grizzly stood watching her. His coat was darker, almost black, shoulders massive and head lowered. He wasn't feeding. He was waiting. Elijah's breath caught. The mother hadn't noticed him yet. The cubs were playing too far from her, splashing in the shallows. One wrong move, one sound, and the entire balance could shift in a second. Elijah raised his binoculars, hands trembling slightly. He could see it in the male's stance, that slow, predatory patience. He'd seen it in wolves, cougars, even hawks. Nature's cold arithmetic, strength over weakness. He whispered to himself, "Don't do it, big guy. Not today." The mother suddenly lifted her head, ears flicking. She sensed him. Her cubs froze mid-play. The air tightened. The male stepped forward once, deliberate and heavy, claws pressing into the wet grass. Elijah's pulse pounded so loud he swore it echoed off the trees. He could shout, make noise, break the tension, but any interference might send all of them into chaos. Instead, he reached slowly into his vest, pulling out the one thing he never thought he'd use, a small flare. His thumb hovered over the cap. He took one last look at the bears, their eyes locked across the valley, and whispered, "Forgive me." He pulled the pin. Mini cliffhanger. The flare hissed to life in his hand, blazing red against the green valley, and every creature within earshot turned toward him. He never imagined that a creature once feared could look back at him with such calm eyes, as if seeing not a ranger but a friend. The morning mist curled low over the meadow, soft and silver, when Aaron returned to the same spot where he'd seen the Grizzly family the evening before. He carried nothing but his field notes, a thermos of tea, and a steady heart. He moved slowly, deliberately, leaving his truck far behind so its engine wouldn't echo through the stillness. He didn't expect to find them so soon, but there they were. The mother grizzly stood at the edge of the stream, the cubs tumbling over one another, their playful growls rising like tiny thunder. She lifted her head when Aaron appeared between the pines, her fur shimmering with morning dew. Aaron stopped immediately, lowering his gaze. The moment stretched thin, delicate as spun glass. He'd been taught that eye contact can mean challenge, but there was something different in her stare. Not threat, not even warning, simply awareness. He could almost feel her assessing him, remembering his scent, his shape, his voice from the night before. He slowly crouched and took out his notebook, jotting down observations without lifting his head too quickly. Every movement was careful, almost reverent. He noted the cub's markings, one slightly lighter with a silver patch on its shoulder, the other darker, clumsier, its paws too big for its small frame. Then, as if testing the distance, the lighter cub approached the stream near where Aaron knelt. It pawed at the water, sniffed a fish that wriggled near the rocks, then turned toward him, curious, fearless in its innocence. Aaron's breath caught. He knew he shouldn't move closer, shouldn't make a sound. But the cub tilted its head, the same gesture he'd seen in dogs when they try to understand human speech. For a fleeting second, their worlds brushed. And then, a sound behind him. A twig snapping. The cub startled, running back to its mother. She stood upright in a single motion, massive and imposing, her shadow cutting across the stream. Aaron froze. He didn't turn, he didn't breathe. Every instinct told him to stay small, still, unthreatening. A long moment passed. Then, instead of charging, the mother lowered herself slowly back to all fours, nudged her cubs and turned her head, not away but toward him, with a kind of acceptance that made his chest ache. She had remembered him. He whispered softly, words she could never understand but somehow carried peace in their tone. "It's okay, girl. I'm not here to hurt you." She blinked, then returned her gaze to her cubs. The tension melted into the rhythm of the forest again. Water trickling, wind whispering, the sound of life continuing as it always had. Aaron sat for a long time, unmoving. When he finally stood to leave, he realized something profound had shifted, not just in her, but in him. The divide between man and wild had thinned, even if just for a morning. That night, as he wrote his report under the dim cabin lamp, he didn't just record data. He described the look in her eyes, that quiet, wordless trust that felt sacred. He ended his entry with a single line, "She knows I mean no harm." But deep down he wondered, would that fragile understanding hold, if their worlds collided again under less forgiving skies? Trust can survive only if both hearts stay calm when nature turns violent. The sky that morning had been pale blue, stretched like silk over the peaks, the kind of quiet that made the forest seem eternal. But by mid-afternoon the air thickened and the light began to dim. The wind came first, slow and irregular, carrying the scent of wet pine and the faint electricity of rain yet to come. Aaron had been tracking the Grizzly family's movement from a respectful distance for days now. He'd learned their rhythm, where they drank, how far the cubs strayed before their mother's huff brought them back, the way she always positioned herself between them and the wind. But that day the forest's harmony began to crack. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the mountains, followed by another, closer this time. Aaron packed his notebook and adjusted his hood, looking toward the ridge where he'd last seen the bears. He hesitated. A part of him said to return to camp, but another part, the one that had begun to feel tied to their fate, pushed him onward. As he climbed toward the slope, rain began to fall, first in soft, pattering drops, then harder, sharper, until it blurred the trail ahead. The wind howled through the pines, snapping branches and scattering leaves in wild swirls. Aaron shielded his eyes and pressed on. He spotted movement near the clearing, the flash of brown fur through the downpour. The mother grizzly was moving fast, head low, pushing her cubs toward the hollow of a fallen cedar. But the smaller cubs slipped, tumbling down a short incline into a gully filling quickly with rainwater. Aaron's heart seized. He could see the cub flailing, struggling to climb up the slick mud wall as the current grew stronger. The mother roared, not in anger but panic. It was a sound that cut through the storm, raw and ancient. Without thinking, Aaron moved. He left the safety of the trees, splashing through the mud toward the gully. Every survival rule screamed don't interfere, don't approach a distressed mother bear, but instinct had already taken over. The cub slid again, its paw scrabbling for purchase. Aaron threw himself forward, gripping a sturdy branch that jutted out near the slope. "Come on, little one," he muttered, voice shaking. He wedged his boots into the mud and reached as far as he dared. The cub let out a frightened yelp. The mother's roar boomed again, closer now. Aaron looked up through sheets of rain. She was charging down the hill toward them, her eyes blazing with fear. For a moment he thought it was over. But then, as if realizing what he was doing, she slowed. The storm raged around them, lightning flashing above, rain cascading over her thick fur, yet she didn't strike. She stood there, massive and trembling, watching him struggle to pull her cub to safety. With one desperate effort, Aaron hauled the cub over the edge. It landed beside him, drenched and shivering. The mother moved immediately, nudging it upright, licking its face, the sound of her huffs like sobs in the rain. Aaron stumbled backward, chest heaving, mud streaking his jacket. For a long moment they stared at each other, the man and the bear both soaked, both alive. Then she turned toward him and made a low, throaty sound, neither growl nor roar, something between warning and gratitude. It echoed in the downpour, soft yet unmistakable. Then she nudged her cubs and led them into the shelter of the cedar hollow. Aaron stayed there, kneeling in the mud, trembling from more than the cold. In that moment he realized he'd crossed a threshold few humans ever had. He'd saved a life that belonged to the wild, and been allowed to walk away unharmed. When he returned to camp that night, thunder still echoing through the valley, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed her eyes, not the glare of danger, but the acknowledgement of trust renewed under the hardest test of all. And somewhere deep inside he knew, the next time they met, nothing in the forest would feel quite the same. Sometimes the forest speaks softly, not in words, but in the quiet gestures it leaves behind. The rain finally ceased near dawn. The forest was hushed, heavy with the scent of soaked moss and pine. Mist curled between the trees like slow breath. Aaron stepped out of his tent, boots sinking into the wet ground, and felt the chill cling to him, but the silence that followed the night's chaos was almost sacred. The storm had left the world changed. Small streams cut new paths through the underbrush, and the air shimmered with that fleeting stillness that follows survival. Aaron gathered his camera and notebook, still damp from the night before, and began walking back toward the slope where it had all happened. He needed to see, to make sure they'd made it through. His steps were cautious, measured. Each branch that snapped beneath his boots made him flinch, not from fear but from reverence. He didn't want to disturb what the forest had endured. When he reached the clearing, the cedar hollow stood dark and quiet beneath the dripping trees. The air still smelled faintly of wet fur and soil. He crouched near the spot where he'd pulled the cub from the gully. The earth there was gouged and muddied, a record of panic, struggle, and life reclaimed. He smiled faintly, tracing the small paw prints that led away toward the hollow. Then, just beside where he had knelt the night before, he noticed something. It was a half-buried pine cone, but not like the others scattered around. This one had been clawed open carefully, its scales peeled back to reveal the empty core. Next to it, a few berries lay pressed into the mud. He froze. It wasn't just debris. It looked placed. Deliberate. He glanced toward the hollow. The bears were nowhere in sight, but faint tracks led into the denser woods. His chest tightened with something wordless. It wasn't human logic. He knew bears didn't thank people, not in any conventional way, but still, something in the gesture struck him deeply. The small pile felt intentional, almost ceremonial, as if she'd left it there to mark that moment of trust. He sat on a fallen log, notebook unopened, and let the quiet settle around him. The forest dripped rhythmically, a single drop landing every few seconds from the branches above, each one punctuating the silence. He could still hear the mother bear's roar from the night before, echoing in his mind like thunder fading behind the mountains. He thought about how close he had been, a single step between coexistence and tragedy, and how, somehow, both of them had chosen restraint. Her in not striking him when she easily could have. Him in refusing to let fear dictate his actions. And in that fragile space life had continued. Aaron reached for the pine cone, turning it gently in his gloved hand. "You're something else, aren't you?" he whispered. The words disappeared into the mist. He stood and looked toward the ridge. The fog was lifting now, revealing the faint pink blush of dawn spreading over the peaks. He could see his breath rising in the cold air, mixing with the steam of the awakening forest. Somewhere distant, a soft grunt echoed, deep, familiar, reassuring. They were still nearby. Watching perhaps. But there was no tension now, no fear. Just quiet understanding. As he began to head back to camp, he took one last look at the clearing, at the half-buried pine cone and the berries beside it. He didn't touch them again. Some things were better left undisturbed, like a message written in a language only the wild could understand. That morning in his report he didn't mention the offering. He only wrote one line under observation. The family survived the storm. The cubs appear strong. The mother remains protective yet calm. But deep down Aaron knew what that meant. She had acknowledged him. Not as an intruder, not as a savior, but as another being sharing the same fragile world for a fleeting moment in time. That quiet, unspoken bond would stay with him longer than any photograph, longer than any field note. It was the kind of thing that couldn't be recorded, only remembered. And yet, as he left the clearing behind, the faintest feeling stirred in him. This wouldn't be their last meeting. The forest had a way of reuniting those who listened. To truly understand the wild, you must walk its path, not as a watcher but as a guest. By the third day after the storm, the forest had dried, its rhythm restored to quiet breathing. The streams gurgled softly, swollen but clear, and shafts of sunlight danced between trembling pine needles. Aaron stood at the ridge overlooking the valley, watching the same mist he'd seen countless times before, but this morning it felt different. It felt like an invitation. He had decided to follow their trail, not for data or reports this time, but out of something deeper, a pull he couldn't quite explain. The bears had moved on, leaving fresh tracks pressed into the softened earth. Wide, heavy prints, hers, followed by the smaller, erratic impressions of the cubs, one slightly limping still from the fall. He began to walk quietly, careful not to disturb the forest's gentle hum. Every few steps he found small signs of their journey, claw marks on bark, berry husks crushed by paws, patches of fur caught on brambles. It was a map written in their language. He felt like he was reading a story no human had ever been meant to read. As he descended into the valley, the trees began to thin, opening to a meadow alive with wildflowers. Bees drifted lazily in the morning light. The scent of lupin and wet earth filled the air. It was here at the meadow's edge that he saw them again. The grizzly mother stood halfway across the field, her massive frame backlit by sunlight. Her cubs tumbled clumsily through the grass, one chasing a butterfly that never seemed to tire of teasing it. The scene was so disarmingly gentle, Aaron almost forgot to breathe. He crouched low, staying downwind, his camera forgotten around his neck. There was no urge to document now, only to witness. For a while he just watched them. The mother occasionally rose onto her hind legs, scanning the horizon, before lowering again to nuzzle her young. The cubs wrestled, rolled, and occasionally paused to look up at her, seeking reassurance. Every movement was a conversation, one he didn't need to translate. Then something shifted. The wind carried his scent toward them. The mother froze, her nose lifting. Aaron tensed, barely daring to move. The cubs paused too, one halfway through a playful pounce. The silence stretched, taut, unbroken, until she turned her head slowly toward the treeline. Their eyes met again. This time there was no storm, no danger, no fear. Just sunlight, warmth, and something almost human in the calmness of her gaze. She studied him for a moment longer, then huffed softly and turned away, nudging her cubs back toward the far slope. They began moving uphill into the shadowed part of the valley. Aaron watched them go until their shapes melted into the trees. He let out a long, unsteady breath, then noticed something peculiar. The smaller cub, the one that had slipped into the gully days ago, lagged behind. Halfway up the slope, it stopped, looked back over its shoulder and stared straight at him. It didn't last long, just a few seconds, but in that small, fleeting glance, Aaron felt something powerful. It wasn't recognition in the human sense but something primal, the acknowledgement of a shared memory, of survival intertwined. Then the cub turned and bounded after its mother, vanishing into the forest. Aaron stayed in the meadow long after they'd gone. The wind swayed the grass gently, carrying with it the last echoes of their movement. He could still hear the faint rustle of branches in the distance, the whisper of a life continuing, wild, free, untamed. For the first time in years he felt completely present. No deadlines, no radio chatter from the ranger station, no noise of human life. Just him and the pulse of the wilderness. He finally understood what drew him to these encounters. Not just curiosity but connection. A quiet reminder that the wild didn't belong to him, and yet, it allowed him to exist within it for brief, miraculous moments. As the sun climbed higher, Aaron took off his hat, ran a hand through his damp hair and smiled faintly. "You did well, little one," he murmured. "Keep close to her." The breeze carried his words away into the trees where they disappeared, maybe unheard, maybe not. But deep in the valley the bears moved on, carrying with them a memory that neither side would ever truly forget. Some bonds never fade, they just go quiet until the season returns to speak again. Winter arrived slowly like a whisper through the mountains. The first snow dusted the pines in late November, and by December the forest lay beneath a thick white quilt. Most trails were closed by then, and the valley where the Grizzly family roamed was all but unreachable. Still, Aaron found himself looking toward it every morning from his ranger station window, wondering if they were hibernating safely beneath the drifts. The silence of winter was different here, not empty but full of meaning. The groan of ice on the river, the creak of old branches bending under snow, even those sounds felt alive. Aaron often walked short patrols near the lower ridges, partly to check for wildlife movement, partly because staying inside too long made him restless. On one such morning the air was sharp enough to sting his lungs. His boots crunched on the frost as he followed a faint animal trail through the pines. The sky glowed pale silver, the kind of cold light that makes everything look fragile. He didn't expect to find anything. Yet 100 yards from the ridge, near the edge of the frozen meadow, something caught his eye. Paw prints. Large ones half filled with fresh snow. He crouched, brushing them gently with a gloved hand. The size and pattern were unmistakable, a grizzly's. His heart quickened. They shouldn't have been out this early in the season unless something had stirred them from hibernation. He followed the trail carefully, each step measured, respectful. The tracks led him along the frozen stream, across the place where wildflowers had once grown. He could picture them there, the cubs tumbling through the grass months ago, and the memory made the cold feel softer somehow. But now the only colors were white and gray, the quiet so deep it felt sacred. Halfway across the meadow the tracks split. Smaller prints veered off, circling near a fallen log. He smiled faintly. Cub prints. 2 of them. Still together. Still alive. He knelt, tracing the smaller set, noticing one was slightly uneven, the same cub that had once slipped into the gully. The limp was faint but still visible in the snow's pattern. "You made it," he whispered, almost afraid to disturb the silence with his voice. Then he saw something else, not tracks this time but a mark on the snow-covered log nearby. Long, deliberate claw strokes. For clean lines, deep and fresh. To anyone else it would have looked ordinary, maybe just a bear sharpening its claws. But Aaron knew better. The marks were too even, too deliberate, placed directly above where the trail from the cubs had paused. Almost like a sign. He stood quietly for a long time, the breath from his lungs hanging in pale clouds before vanishing. The wind brushed past him, stirring powdery snow off the branches above. It was as if the forest had exhaled too. He didn't try to follow the tracks beyond the meadow. The snow grew too deep, and the forest beyond was no place for a man alone in winter. Instead he took one slow step back and simply looked, at the prints, the marks, the wide silent expanse that held their memory. It struck him then, the bears weren't just surviving. They were thriving. Despite storms, cold, and distance, their story was still unfolding somewhere in the hidden heart of the valley. And he had been allowed a glimpse of it, a chapter that wasn't his to write, only to witness. As he turned to head back, a faint flurry began to fall, erasing the tracks almost as soon as he made them. Within minutes, the meadow was smooth again, blank as untouched paper. It should have saddened him, the way evidence disappeared so quickly, but instead he felt peace. Some stories, he thought, weren't meant to be preserved in photographs or notebooks. They were meant to live briefly, then fade, leaving only the feeling behind. He paused at the ridge and took one last look at the white expanse. "Sleep well," he murmured into the wind. The forest gave no answer, But deep beneath the snow, in a den hollowed out by earth and fur, a family of grizzlies slept soundly, their heartbeats steady, their warmth a quiet promise that spring would bring them together again. And somewhere in his chest, Aaron felt the same rhythm, the wild's quiet, eternal pulse. The wild never forgets, it just waits until spring to remind you what still matters. By early May the valley began to thaw. Streams broke free from their icy silence, and the scent of pine resin and wet soil returned to the air. Birds had come back too, flashes of blue and gold weaving through the forest canopy. Each sound, each rustle, felt like the forest's first deep breath after months of holding still. Aaron had been reassigned to a different section of the park for the winter, but as soon as the roads cleared, he requested to return. The ranger in charge had raised an eyebrow. The valley wasn't exactly a hot spot for activity, but Aaron only smiled and said, "There's something I need to check on." The drive up the old mountain trail was quiet. Meltwater trickled down the slopes, cutting silver paths through mossy stone. When he finally reached the familiar ridge, his chest tightened with the same awe it always brought. The forest below was alive again, green, moving, awake. He walked slowly, his boots sinking slightly in the soft earth, following the same direction he had taken months ago through the snow. Every step stirred memories, the storm, the cry of the cub, the soft gift of berries and pine cones. Each scene replayed in his mind like faint light through trees. The meadow was different now. Wildflowers had returned, painting the ground in hues of violet and yellow. The air was warm, trembling faintly with bees and birdsong. He stopped at the fallen cedar, now half covered in moss, and smiled softly. The world had healed itself again. He crouched near the log where the claw marks had been, but the snow was gone, and only faint grooves remained, nearly erased by time. He brushed his hand over them, remembering. For a moment he thought that would be enough, just to stand there, to feel the weight of memory. But then from somewhere beyond the meadow he heard it. A sound low and familiar, not a roar but a deep, resonant huff that vibrated through the trees. Aaron froze, heart pounding. He turned slowly toward the sound. Out from between the pines emerged a shape he knew instantly, the broad, dark form of the mother grizzly. Her coat gleamed in the sunlight, and she moved with a steady, confident grace. Behind her, two cubs trotted, taller now, leaner, their fur glinting bronze under the light. They stopped at the meadow's edge. She lifted her head, sniffing the wind. Their eyes met again, that same quiet thread of recognition spanning the space between them. For a long time neither moved. The world seemed to pause, the only sound the rustle of grass, the sigh of the wind. Aaron's breath came shallow, his heart full. She wasn't afraid. Not wary. Just aware. The cubs looked at him curiously before wandering toward a patch of wildflowers, pawing the earth, snuffling playfully. The mother stayed still, watching him. Then, in one small deliberate motion, she lowered her head, not quite a bow but something close. A gesture that seemed to acknowledge his presence, his respect. Aaron didn't move closer. He knew better. Instead he took off his hat and held it to his chest, a quiet greeting, a thank you without words. After a moment she turned, nudged her cubs gently, and began walking toward the far slope, the same path as before. But before vanishing into the trees she paused one last time and looked back. Her eyes caught the sunlight, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then she was gone. Aaron stood there for a long time, letting the quiet return. He felt the kind of peace that doesn't come often in a human life, the kind that only the wild can give, then take back again when it's time. Later, back at the ranger station, he opened his notebook. Most pages were filled with observations, dates, weather, behaviors. But on the last page he wrote something different this time. They made it through another winter. Stronger. Wiser. So did I. He closed the notebook and smiled faintly. The radio crackled in the background, but he barely heard it. His thoughts were somewhere deep in the forest, with a family of bears that had once changed everything he believed about fear, trust, and belonging. He didn't need to see them again to know they were out there. The forest had its own way of keeping promises. And when the wind brushed through the open window, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and wildflowers, Aaron felt it again, that quiet, eternal heartbeat of the wild, reminding him that he had once been part of something truly alive. In every heartbeat of the forest, there's a story of trust waiting to be heard. If this moment touched you, share it. Let more people remember that we don't just live near the wild, we live with it.